My name is Troy Stangerone. I'm the Senior Director for Congressional Affairs and Trade here at the Korea Economic Institute. I'd like to thank you all for coming. As you know, this past fall, South Korea went through a process that ultimately led to early this winter the impeachment of former President Park Geun-hye, which then resulted in a snap presidential election in South Korea. We have now gone through that election, and Moon Jae-in has become the new president of South Korea. And unlike prior presidents, because of the nature of this election, he has no transition period. Instead, he immediately assumes office in South Korea. We are very fortunate today to talk about how this election will impact U.S.-Korea relations, policy towards North Korea, economic relations between our two countries as well, as a series of other important issues. And we're very fortunate to have three very good experts and knowledgeable individuals, as well as John Burden, formerly of the Financial Times, in Seoul, and as well now with the Korea Times and the Nikkei Asian Review here in Washington. With John, we have Scott Snyder from the Council of Foreign Relations. We also have Bruce Klingner from the Heritage Foundation, and former Assemblyman Song Ho-chang. So we're very fortunate to have them all. I know we have a lot to discuss, so I want to turn things over to John. But for further information on all of our speakers, you have their bios with you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Troy. And I also want to thank our panel for giving their valuable time today to come here and talk about South Korea under Moon Jae-in. My first question is, and I'll turn to you, Scott, first. Why do you think Moon won? And what does that say about the political and social trends in Korea?
Okay, well, I think the major factor that ended up shaping this election was really the impeachment and the public frustration with the corruption that they saw in South Korean leadership. It's a symptom of an underlying problem related to cozy elite relations in South Korean society that has become, I think, a flashpoint within South Korea's, within the society. And Moon came along and was first the face of the protest, along with other leaders of his party. As a result, support for his party in South Korea went up by about 10 to 15 points, even before the election started. And then he has an agenda for promoting transparency, and really, I guess the succinct way to say it would be moving toward a more fair and equal opportunity society, rather than one in which it feels like you really have to have connections or money in order to be able to get ahead or stay ahead.
Assemblyman Song, would you agree with Scott, or?
Yes, agree.
Right.
And I prepare the message.
Right.
And I think it's better to read this message. I think one of the biggest factor for Mr. Moon's victory is his own personality and his power with his organization in Democratic Party in Korea. From very early on, Mr. Moon has a strong commitment to justice and public service. And he truly values trust among the people. He was not a politician originally, but he had been a human rights lawyer and a civil activist for more than 30 years. And when former President Roh Moo-hyun started his career as a politician, Mr. Moon also had been offered by former President Kim Young-sam, but he had declined it because he is a human rights lawyer, and he thought he is an activist. And when President Roh was elected and offered to Mr. Moon to the chief secretary for Civil Affairs in Cheongwade. He accepted that offer on condition that the secretary position is his final last long in President No's administration. He left the Blue House after the quitted the chief secretary for Civil Affairs, as he said. And thereafter, Mr. Moon helped President No in No's impeachment trial. And President No's suicide made him come back to the politician position. Yeah. And he valued faith most. His return to the political world is the destiny he cannot escape, I think. And President Moon is a kind and people person. He maintains open mind in people's oppositions and keeps long-standing friendship of friends. Thus, in political field, even opposite politicians trust him and are impressed by his sincerity and loyalty.
Bruce, do you what do you think is the reason why?
First of all, thank you to KEI for the opportunity to be here. I was on a panel discussion the day after the U.S. election, and I had put a lot of effort into identifying all the precepts of what the Hillary Clinton Asia policy would be. So I was determined not to, and all my talking points were valid till about 9:30 the night before. So I was determined not to go through that. So I guess first things first, someone had an election apparently, and okay, we'll go from there. I think, as others have pointed out, you have the political pendulum really in any country, and after 10 years of conservative rule, it's sort of to be expected that the pendulum would go the other way. There's sort of, after a while you want to throw the bums out and put a different group in, and then you'll get frustrated with them. So in a way, the liberals or the progressives already had an advantage. And certainly, as Scott and Sung pointed out, is with the impeachment, it really just sort of splattered the conservatives with a taint that really would be extremely difficult to overcome. So the conservatives imploded along the pro-PAC, anti-PAC, or non-PAC lines that they had been struggling with for the 5 years of her term. And I think it really was Moon Jae-in's or the progressives' election to lose. Now, Ahn Cheol-soo pulled neck and neck for a while, and so it had appeared at least that there might be an upset. But then Moon, again, maintained his core base of 40%. So it really, I think, was almost a foregone conclusion that he would be elected, given the impeachment. Now, he tried to appeal to more than his core base, and didn't seem to be able to go beyond that number that he had consistently throughout the election. So he tried tacking to the center on some national security issues. We'll see whether he stays there in ruling from the center or whether he goes back to the left.
So, but you would then agree that it was mostly domestic issues on which the election was fought, not national security and North Korea.
I think really most elections in any country are really people voting their pocketbook, whether a frustration with the party in power or just whichever party they think will impact the economy or their economy the best. So I think, even though we fixate on North Korea, we fixate on the alliance or THAAD or South Korea's relationship with the U.S. vis-a-vis China or others. In talking with Koreans, they'll say, well, you guys are focused on that, but really Korea was focused on reform and the economy.
What do you expect, Scott, in terms of North Korean policy under Moon? He has a very full record of statements, but do you think he's actually going to implement those?
Certainly he has indicated, I guess I interpret broadly the direction that he's headed as one that really wants to pursue every possible peaceful option by which to address the North Korea issue. with the faith that that is going to work. And maybe in a way that's the core of the cleavage, is whether or not we have faith that it's going to work on either side in terms of the prospect for engagement and a peaceful pathway. The other distinctive element or priority of the Moon platform really is to see North Korea as a market. And that also is an area in which there's a potential for contradiction between the pressure-led strategy of the United States and a possible emphasis on economic engagement with North Korea. But really, I think that at this point, these are issues that are going to have to be discussed among and between leaders in the U.S. and South Korea. And my own view is that there is probably a way of sequencing a lot of the elements of the strategy that the Trump administration has laid out, together with the approach that the Moon presidency is emphasizing, in ways that maybe we can move forward. I don't think that we should automatically presume, as seems to be the dominant theme, that we're on a collision course, because the fact of the matter is that, this is in the context of alliance. It means that this is a family matter, and within families, you've got to work through these issues in order to be able to move forward. And so, as long as both leaders respect the fact that we're bound by the alliance, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to move forward in a very positive way.
What do you expect, Mr. Sung, from Moon in terms of North Korean policy?
I think he's translate is not working. True.
Do you want me to ask that question again?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you expect from President Moon in terms of North Korean policy? What do you think that he will do?
I think, first of all, the strengthening to U.S.-Korea alliance is truly one of Mr. Moon's major priorities. So, about the North Korea issue, I think he totally supports the maximum pressure and engagement.
Mm-hmm.
The next new James administration will be according to the U.S. policy about the.
So you don't see any clash between Washington and Seoul, as Scott says. That seems to be the consensus view. Yeah. I mean, Bruce, what do you think he's going to try to do?
Well, to be simplistic, it depends on how he implements his pledges and his promises. Just as the same with President Trump. Both presidents have said enough things which appear, open to interpretation on any number of things. So on, say, the alliance, Moon has said things like, I'm America's friend, the alliance is the bedrock of Korean diplomacy or democracy. He wants to strengthen the alliance. So you could say, well, that sounds like a conservative. How can you go against that? But he's also said things like he wants to negotiate the THAAD agreement with not only the United States, but China. So negotiating South Korea's security with a country which has been putting forth disingenuous claims about the THAAD system. He also wants the wartime OPCON transfer to South Korea seemingly quickly. And when that was done before, it caused a great deal of angst in South Korea when Roh Moo-hyun wanted it. Also on, he wants to increase South Korea's independent defense capabilities. So continuing to have their independent missile defense system not integrated with the broader, more effective allied missile defense system. So just from there, you can either spin he wants to strengthen the alliance, or you could see a lot of cases, you could spin it that he wants to go on a more independent path, even on the military structure. And then I think the same with North Korea. You could spin it either as, while maintaining a strong relationship with the United States, he wants to reach out to North Korea. He wants to have sanctions and engagement. So you can say, well, that sounds some cases like statements from senior U.S. officials, or you could see it as, and he brings a lot of baggage to the table because his relationship and his involvement in the Nomi Hunt administration, so you could see it as, well, there could be, if not divergence, turbulence in the relationship.
What do you think about him reopening Kaesong industrial complex? Do you think he would go ahead with something
Well,
like
if he
that?
does, it's a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. So he would have to work in conjunction with the UN, the 1718 Committee, for prior approval of economic engagement with North Korea, and also the transparency measures in previous resolutions. So it would be a very troublesome move forward if he does it without conjunction with sort of not only U.S. but UN actions.
I mean, Scott, before you indicated that you're a bit more optimistic about relations between the U.S. and Washington. Do you think that some of the constraining factors on Moon in terms of his North Korean policy is that he can't afford to antagonize Washington, and at the same time, he can't afford to antagonize the conservative opposition in the National Assembly, since his Moon's Minju party lacks a majority? I mean, do you think those are constraining factors on his room for maneuver on North Korea?
Yes, John, you have correctly identified both domestic and international constraints that will influence how the Moon administration is going to carry out its policy. The main issue here is really, we've seen this platform before. It's the Nomuhyun platform, and its comeback. And if we think about what the situation was 15 years ago between Nomuhyun and George W. Bush, there were tensions, there were frictions, but we managed, and we got through it. And I think that we'll probably see something very similar. Bruce kind of put the no experience into a negative light, but, on the other hand, we have somebody who actually has some experience. And 15 years ago, we were dealing with a bunch of people who had no experience, who came in and took over South Korean government. And I think that in the first 24 hours, some of that experience is showing. I think he did a very good job with his inauguration kind of address. And also, apparently, there was just a phone call this morning between Trump and Moon, and that seems to have gone okay. So the outstanding question, I think we know what the issues are. Really, the outstanding question is chemistry. We'll have to see how that is dealt with. And there will be tensions and frictions. I just think that they're going to be manageable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Bruce, what do you... is there a general Washington consensus now about Moon? I mean, is there a hint of suspicion or cautiousness about him coming to power?
Well, I think, as Scott pointed out, there's a lot of concern or questions. I think given the fact that he was chief of staff to know, and that there were tensions in the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea during his presidency, I don't think it's overstating it to say there are concerns as to how things will go. Again, it matters in how the two presidents develop a relationship, sort of how strongly each one pushes a policy which on the surface seems to be very divergent. If President Trump has talked about maximum pressure sort of and engagement if certain conditions are met, which I think are pretty high conditions, and if Moon is wanting to meet fairly early or quickly with North Korea, although he has also said, if conditions permit. I mean, there's at least the potential for divergence, and if you have divergence, then you can have tension. Now, under Nomi Hunt, some will say, look, how could it have been so bad? Because we got things accomplished, Chorus and the realignment of U.S. forces down to Pyeongtaek and things. And I'd say, well, on Chorus, I give great kudos to No. I think he, really sort of in a way stood up against his political base to move forward on a very critically important, mutually beneficial free trade agreement between our countries. On things like, well, he sent troops to Iraq. Well, there was a lot of things there where he said, maybe we should have a national vote on this because I'm not so sure about it. And he even publicly said, well, I'm sending the forces to Iraq because I'm hoping in return Bush will soften his North Korea policy. So on the surface, it could be seen as, yeah, he sent troops over on a U.S. initiative, et cetera, but it was grudging and it was as a quid pro quo for changing U.S. policy on North Korea.
What do you? Oh, yeah.
I
Go
want
on,
to
please.
add, yes, the principally for the U.S., the Korea Peninsula issue is a relative minor issue. So for this reason, United States failure to sufficiently access the rapidly changing the political environment of Korean Peninsula may lead to missing an appropriate time frame for an effective intervention, I think. So this reality is the reason why North Korea now owns its own nuclear arsenal. In order to prevent another disaster and eliminate the dangers of North Korea's nuclear threat, it is necessary to put in the effort to meticulously assess the situation and work hard to create concrete politics. So Mr. Moon will do exactly that, and it will sustainously strengthen to the U.S.-Korea alliance and the mutual trust. I think that is different between the former President Park Geun-hye and Mr. Moon.
I want to, excuse me, I want to pick up a point that Bruce just raised about Chorus, which is the U.S., excuse me, the U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement. Where do you see that going I mean, is that a potential clash point between Washington and Seoul, given President Trump's recent comments about renegotiating or even ending the treaty? Or do you think he's raised that as maybe a pointed reminder that he could give trouble to Korea on trade issues unless they play ball on North Korea? Scott?
Well, I think Korea has to take it seriously when the Trump administration suggests that it wants to revise the agreement. My understanding from Moon's advisors is that they like the agreement because they, of course, were the ones who began the process of negotiating with the George W. Bush administration. And so, I mean, in a way, the risk for Chorus, as with the risk of almost every of the major flashpoint issues in the U.S.-Korea relationship, is whether or not we can manage them without having them be politicized. And there's probably some kind of wiggle room to address some concerns that are outstanding related to the agreement. But I actually think that, in a way, the bigger issue is that they're both kind of looking at the agreement from fundamentally different perspectives. And the Koreans probably haven't quite caught up to the idea that for Trump, the only thing that matters is the merchandise trade balance. And that is a contested view, I think, even within the U.S. And probably it's going to take some efforts to absorb that and try to figure out how to respond to it on the Korean side. They're going to need some time to try to put together a strategy on that, I think.
Bruce?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the intent and the messaging. You can say with Chorus, it's 5 years old, maybe there are things that need to be tweaked, and there's a mechanism for doing that. Maybe some things didn't work out as well as you wanted to, so let's tweak the language or tweak the provisions. Similarly with NAFTA, you can say, well, that's sort of so old that there are entire technologies which have been created since that was signed. Why don't we get the folks together and sort of update it and address technologies that are new or perhaps outdated. You can do that amongst trading partners. But if your messaging is, this is the worst ever, I want to blow it up, I want to pull away from it, well, you're going into the negotiations, perhaps you think with greater leverage, but you've just signaled that you really don't care about that agreement and you're willing to walk away from it. So if it's just negotiating leverage, it may be counterproductive in coming in with guns a-blazing, and then even, sort of laying a red line in a way of, if I don't get everything I want, we're going to walk away, and then later saying, well, we're not going to walk away. We're just going to tweak a little bit, and then, you kind of get whiplash a bit on the messaging. Similarly with the comments during the campaign last year on cost sharing agreement. We want 100% reimbursement or we walk. Well, that sort of makes an alliance a bit of a mercenary arrangement where, it doesn't address that it is in U.S. national interest to have alliances. It is in U.S. national interest because we have, such integral national interests, not only in Asia but in Europe. And it's in our interest to have our forces overseas. It's a stabilizing mechanism for not only our allies but for us. So it's not that we need 100% reimbursement because a lot of it is serving our purposes.
Mr. Sung, if you were advising President Moon right now, what would you say he should do to win the support of the American people?
I try to advise so many things, especially is Trump administration is very unfamiliar Korean as well as U.S. Especially about the trade. I think the trade is very related with security and foreign policy, and but this trade between the two allies, U.S. and Korea, is must be differentiated from trade with other countries, and the trade should take account not only in ensuring benefits for one's own country, but also mutual benefits and consideration for allies. We shouldn't just simply look at the amount of profits gained from trade, but these seek way to foster relations by ensuring mutually beneficial long-term economic growth. So I think we have too many concerns about this kind of situation.
Do you have, Scott or Bruce, do you have any advice for President Moon?
Well, let me just say, we've got Wendy Cutler and Marcus Noland in the audience, both of whom are really the people that this chorus issue should probably be directed to for comment. But, if I can just address the political dimension of this, because I think the critical issue, if we look back at Roh Moo-hyun and look at who's going to be advising Moon Jae-in, essentially what it means is that it's likely that he has people in his camp, some of whom are pro-alliance and some of whom are pro-autonomy. And this alliance versus autonomy tension is really a major tension that has always been there as a part of South Korean foreign policy. And so what that tells us, I think, is that if the U.S. can manage it well in order to ensure that we're promoting the pro-alliance people and don't get on the wrong side of this impulse for autonomy, then many of these issues can be dealt with in a rather quiet way. But where the U.S. makes unilateral statements, I can think of a few recent examples, that have an impact or resonate politically in South Korea in a negative way, that's going to represent a setback for us in terms of being able to effectively manage the relationship.
Scott, you've written a book about, or co-authored a book about Korean-Japanese relations. What do you expect Tokyo-Seoul relations to go under Moon? And I also would like to hear your views about Seoul-Beijing as well.
Okay, well, newly elected President Moon in his inauguration address indicated that his willingness to go to Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo, and possibly Pyongyang, in order to further South Korean security interests. He has one major obstacle in terms of his own political pledges during the campaign, and that is that he and all the other candidates pledged to reverse the Comfort Women Agreement. And I think a lot hinges on how the South Korean foreign policy advisors in the Moon administration decided to frame this issue. If trying to reopen the issue of the Comfort Women Agreement means putting themselves back in the same box that Park Geun-hye had been in at the beginning of her administration, where Comfort Woman is a condition for all other aspects of the relationship, then we're going to see a stalemated relationship, and it's going to be a real drag on South Korean foreign policy. But if they can find a way to kind of bifurcate these issues, continue to try to address the past while also moving forward, then I think that offers an alternative pathway, and we'll just have to wait and see. It's a good early test for the foreign policy acumen of the Moon administration and his advisors.
Do you, Mr. Song, do you have any views about relations with Tokyo and Beijing, particularly Comfort Women for Japan and THAAD for China?
Japanese ally of Korea, but because of Japanese colonial past, the Korea's ally between Japan is different from Korea and US. Whether it's about the issue of comfort woman or a territory issue, this issue can also only be resolved with a solution based on the international law and norms that will be acceptable to the aggrieved nation and its people. So, because the Park and the Abe administration didn't reach a settlement that satisfied those problems. So problems to continue to persist, I think. So the past administration's settlement was not in accord with international law and global norm. So, and it's eventually worsened an anti-Japanese sentiment among the Korean people. So I therefore believe the agreement need to be re-examined.
Bruce, what about in terms of THAAD and China? What do you think that Moon will do about that, given that he's under a real dilemma?
Well, he's moved from opposition to THAAD to really being on the fence. Whenever asked, he kept just sort of saying, well, the next government should deal with that. And they're like, well, sir, you will be the next government. Well, the next government should do it. So he just sort of kept trying to punt on that. More recently, as I said, as he was tacking to the center on a number of issues, I think he sort of said, well, if North Korea does a 6 test, then it's sort of a done deal, which you could say, well, why wouldn't it be a done deal after 5 or 4 or 3? So, and given the North Korean threat to you now, that the North Koreans have miniaturized, they have weaponized, they almost certainly have Nodong nuclear-tipped missiles today, which can hit your country. And whereas in the past, No Mu-hun said, oh, Scud missiles, they don't have a military target, they're just a political tool. It's like, well, sir, the only military target they have is South Korea. So they've got hundreds of Scuds that are aimed at South Korea. So I think, at least in my view, it's a question of South Korea's sovereignty, national security, and that if you're willing to negotiate that away with China, then you're willing to negotiate anything away. South Korea and the U.S. have repeatedly tried to offer technical briefings to Beijing, and they've refused. Park Geun-hye tried to talk about it during a summit with Xi Jinping, and he turned it down because they know that's not only false, it's disingenuous. So I think even the statements that he'll negotiate with China about it, I think that raises some concerns.
We agreed before that the election was basically based on domestic issues. And in terms of domestic policy, President Moon has proposed ways to restructure the big conglomerate, the Chaebol. He wants to spend more public funds on creating jobs for youth to reduce the high unemployment in that sector and to spend more on infrastructure to stimulate the economy. What do you, given the fact that he only has a plurality now in the National Assembly, how effective do you think, or can he be in getting that legislation through Parliament? Scott?
He obviously needs cooperation. I mean, the other aspect of the current situation in South Korea is that when the Park administration came in, the National Assembly reached an agreement that nothing would move forward unless all the parties have consensus or unless a single party can mobilize 60%. They've got a 60% threshold. They've abandoned their nuclear option at the South Korean National Assembly level. But what that means is that it's a very high bar in order to get things through. It's going to require cooperation. His party is a minority, and even if you add the People's Party in a kind of working coalition, you barely get to that level maybe where you would get to 3/5. So he has some real challenges. The advantage that he has is that, in this environment, I think a lot of the elements of his platform and agenda, in terms of, having job expansion, public sector job expansion in order to address high unemployment levels among youth, the need for rolling out a stronger set of public services to support elderly, the issue of trying to rebalance and address economic inequality and the kind of advantages structurally that Chaebols have. Those are all things that I think actually have relatively broad appeal, we've really come to a point, I think, within South Korea where there's a recognition that there's a necessity to move forward. Even Park paid lip service to a lot of those issues. It just didn't happen.
Do you think that we would see some type of trade-off of, let's say, President Moon softening his policy or what he wants to achieve on North Korea in return for getting conservative votes, let's say, for corporate reforms?
The way I would put it is the priority is probably going to be domestic.
Right.
And that's where you need to spend your political capital.
Right.
And we'll have to see how it plays out.
Mr. Sung, do you think that President Moon can achieve his legislative goals? Or what type of deals will he need to do to cut with the conservative opposition?
I can help him. I am a Democratic Party member right now. And, I was manager of campaign manager of Mr. Ahn Cheol-soo. And he go out I really related both of the party members. I can help you, and I think we have many people try connection and most of all, I think party is not quite a different. They have a similar policy and political and economic. Most of the policy is similar, very similar, and Mr. Moon and Mr. Ahn, they have the same what do you say, policy, and to try to make another and reform of old political system and old custom in politics. So I think they can they can make same or similar policy in the National Assembly.
So, Scott, I mean, what do you think then are going to be President Moon's priorities? I mean, if you had to do the top 3 issues, where do you think that's going to go?
I think it's most of it, well, the way that he ordered his inauguration address, actually, he put security first. And so I do think that there's an awareness of the importance of the need to fill the political vacuum that has existed in South Korea for the past 6 months. But the real driver is going to have to be trying to get the economy moving, try to address these issues of transparency. He's also, I think, importantly mentioned independence for the prosecution and legal authorities, which, of course, directly flows from the circumstances around the impeachment process.
I mean, Bruce, do you think that security will wind up being his number one concern, despite what he said during the campaign?
Well, I think first of all, on Chaebol reform, certainly he wants, I think he has a very strong impetus to try to do something. And I think right now the Korean public really wants to do something to change what seems to be endemic corruption and the sort of the government-Chaebol relationship. So I think there's sort of the tsunami of intent to do things. I think maybe it's a bridge too far to see the Conservative Party sort of holding Chaebol reform hostage to softening or hardening a North Korea policy. But regardless of that, I just think back of Roh Moo-hyun came in wanting to do Chaebol reform and had very strong support. Now, once his reform measures started impacting the Chaebol economies or their economics and then the national economy, then the people kind of flip-flopped and they were like, well, let's not do that. It's hurting the national economy because the Chaebol are such an oversized, have such an oversized impact. So then people are saying, well, let's back off that Chaebol reform. So there was a bit of a to and fro on that. So if the Chaebol reform start impacting, the Chaebol's money-making operations for the country, and I believe Samsung is still 25% of the GDP of South Korea, if I'm right, then if it impacts the national economy at a time when there's a concern that it's very slow, would that cause people to go back against the Chaebol reform? We'd have to see. I think on priorities, I think any president, not only South Korea, but the U.S. comes in wanting to focus on domestic issues. That's what they feel the voters wanted. That's sort of where the votes were from. But the world intrudes. And certainly North Korea, whether it's doing something so it's not ignored, or it's doing it because it's the next step in their technological development, North Korea doesn't stay quiet for very long. So whether North Korea doesn't do any more nuclear tests, any more missile testing or exercising of any kind, I doubt that. So when we have the next nuclear test, the next missile tests, particularly an ICBM test, well then you have a North Korean crisis for both Trump and No. And then, we'll see how they work together. If it's a case of, all right, North Korea did this, we need to increase pressure, more sanctions, do this. And if No say, no, we need to lower the tension, and maybe it's only they're doing that because of the U.S. actions, that's where you can have some convergence. So I think on right now, after, say, the 4th nuclear test, we have this new international consensus on the need to pressure North Korea. It didn't really happen after the first 3, but certainly after the 4th. So you now have not only the UN sanctions, you have new U.S. laws which are pushing the previous administration to do things that they had been reluctant to do. And if you have a new administration which is more willing to do that. And then another parallel track was South Korea and others going around the world talking to North Korea's legitimate business partners, raising crimes against humanity, slave labor conditions, siphoning the wages of the overseas worker to the nuclear program, crimes against humanity, use of a chemical weapon of mass destruction in a civilian airport. It weaned away more of the North Korean business partners. So if you sort of think of like an old Wild West movie, if the sheriff finally got the townspeople energized and deputized and they finally got Black Bart, cornered in Deadwood Gulch, is Moon Jae-in going to be hey guys, there's a secret exit over here. I don't know, here's a couple bags of cash too. and if South Korea implements the required reform or sanctions less vigorously, other countries will say, well, why should I do that? Because until South Korea closed Kaesong, countries are saying, look, you're telling me I should be tougher on sanctions, but you're siphoning 120 mil to their nuke program. Why should I be tough? So if he backs off, we could sort of see a softening of the international coalition.
Mr. Song, do you think that President Moon will focus on the economy rather than on security?
Yes, I want to add to some misunderstanding in. Can I speak Korean?
Yeah, I think we have translation.
I think two things is very important misunderstanding about Mr. Moon. Is first one is 경제 재벌 개혁.
Okay.
재벌. Yeah. 재벌 개혁에 대해서
well, let me speak on the misunderstandings that people have about Mr. Moon and his policies. Oftentimes people say that Mr. Moon may be pushing for a more severe reformation when it comes to chaebols, and that Mr. Moon would somehow take away power from the chaebols in Korea. No, that's not what he's intending to do. What he wants to do is, for his party as well, is that they want to make the chaebols more of a competitor. He wants these companies to be more transparent, and that would lead to the companies being more competitive on the global market. So the reformation is not by way of more regulations to these corporations, but allowing for them to operate more on the global platform. So he does not want these chaebols to be Korean companies. He wants these companies to be global companies. As to North Korean policies of Moon, the GIC or any relations that South Korea has to have with North Korea when it comes to the economy, it's not just helping North Koreans all the time, but it's going to be more of a bilateral relationship if there is to be one. And under the aegis of the Korea-U.S. alliance, we intend to resolve the North Korean nuclear issues. It's not like we will be a everlasting friend to North Korea. No, that's not what he wants to do.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, National Assembly Song made some very important points, and I think that they're there in the platforms. The question that I think people here maybe are still asking themselves is this lip service, or is it really going to happen? And so the answer really is we've got to hold Moon to his promises and his platform, and if that happens, then we'll be on the right track.
그 공약 부분에
The
대해서도
pledges that he made as a candidate, I think there's been some misunderstanding as well.
뭐 북한에 대한
As to North Korea supporting an opening of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, now basically he's trying to say that we want to have a better dialogue with North Korea, and one way of having dialogue would be these other measures. But he's not saying that these would be the preliminary things to happen. These would be the result of the alliance, the result of the cooperation that we have together. So under the aegis of U.S.-Korea alliance, North Korean problems would be dealt with. So any opening is to be had after the cooperation is had.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Song. I think it's time now to open the floor for questions, and I think we have people who are carrying around microphones. So if you can wait and raise your hand, and then wait until the person with the microphone comes, and then identify yourself if you could. Okay, in the gentleman in the front there.
Yeah, excellent discussion. George Hutchinson, I'm a regional planning consultant with an expertise in Korean affairs. The area really that was touched on a little bit, but we really didn't talk about it a lot, was the Beijing Seoul. I mean, I think hovering above all the points that you guys discussed is where does, I guess my question is, where does repairing relations with Beijing rack and stack in Moon's agenda?
Well, I think even in the inauguration address, he said he's, going to sort of travel to all the capitals. Certainly, the relationship with China is critical. It's deteriorated in the last number of months because of the really ham-handed tactics by China. Economic warfare, threats of diplomatic and military action. So, to the point where now the South Korean public opinion of China is lower than that of Japan, which, given the history issues, is saying something. So, I think there's sort of a cyclical South Korean view of China. That China will do things periodically, and there will be a negative view taken by the South Korean public. And then either if China stops doing that, the relationship will get better, or South Korea will see that, its economic relations are such strongly aligned with China. So we'll have to see. I would hope that Moon does not back down on South Korean national security, that it points out that it's because of your ally, China, that is taking these offensive actions and capabilities put in place that are directly threatening South Korea, that we are doing this. So, it is a national security issue. It is a matter of sovereignty. So this one is not negotiable, but let's talk about the range of other things. But I think just as when we have North Korea, when it does its next action, or just the way it continually insults the leadership of our countries and threatens and stuff, it sort of raises the true nature of the regime. And if China continues to pursue this economic warfare under a progressive president, then someone who I think would be more likely to be, aligned with China or want to improve relations with China, if China's even doing it to a progressive administration, then I think the problems will continue.
예, 한 가지를 더.
Now, if I also may add to Mr. Klingler's statement, the Beijing economic repression, retaliation that they are carrying out against Seoul, it's actually not just hurting the Seoulites or the Koreans, it also hurts the people in China. And why does China keep on doing this when it hurts them as well, not just the South Koreans? So China wants something from us, and by pressuring South Korea, China wants to see a change, not just in Korea, but in the U.S. and Japan, as well as North Korea. So by doing all these actions, they want the parties to come together, all the interested parties to come together and discuss a resolution. And because we have decided not to discuss or come to dialogues multilaterally, China is frustrated because they are unable to bring about any resolution. And to that, in that regards, I actually blame Park Geun-hye. She had refused to talk with China on these various issues, including security issues. And I think it's important that whenever we take measures, that we don't do it on our own, but actually as a result of having discussed these measures with other neighbors.
I think that South Korea needs to improve its relationship with China, and having a new president provides an opportunity for a new start. But I actually think the way that they should proceed on that is to focus bilaterally on establishing good communication and cooperation, rather than necessarily allowing themselves to be drawn into this geostrategic interplay, especially as related to the THAAD issue, which crosses all these lines. Because I don't think that that is going to be profitable for South Korea, precisely because it actually exaggerates the influence of this issue. It plays into, I think, China's attempts to use it as leverage. And so, and then also on the Beijing side, they've got to realize that they've set their diplomacy back by taking the approach that they have.
Gentlemen.
Thanks very much, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Great discussion, guys, as always. I'm seeking clarity, and I guess you are too, on if there is to be a renewed South Korean diplomatic initiative with North Korea. Is it clear yet whether President Moon will try to keep the strategic issues off to one side and focus on the economic and the family reunion and that kind of thing, or has he been clear that negotiations have to include, from South Korea's standpoint, have to include the strategic issues? And on the strategic issues, has he been clear on this key question? Negotiating a freeze with North Korea of what they've got now runs the risk of accepting them as a nuclear power. Has he talked about that? And I'm sorry, I just haven't found it, but I haven't looked hard. Trump is not clear on that either. So if you have some thoughts on what the U.S. may be heading towards on what are we willing to accept in order to get freeze talks, that would be useful. But if we're going to have talks with North Korea, in other words, what's he going to talk about? And is he going to try combined strategic, economic, or just one or the other? So thank you.
I would say the first issue is really, in a way, Moon's already issued his statement of desire to re-engage with North Korea. He's appointed head of the National Intelligence Service, who is a veteran of inter-Korean talks in 2000 and 2007, Sahun. He's doing everything he can to signal an openness and a willingness to reestablish dialogue. And frankly, on the South Korean side, on the North Korean side, I don't think they are configured yet to be able to have a dialogue. They've basically got a military man whose life has been spent thinking about subverting South Korea in charge of their South Korea policy. And so it's going to be interesting to see how North Korea responds and whether they can, open some space. But if they do, I think, have a dialogue, I think they're going to start with the humanitarian issues and maybe focus on some of the family reunions and kind of build up from there. There's ambiguity, I think, related to the denuclearization issue. It's an essential objective as far as I can tell, but it may or may not be a precondition. And I think that a lot of the advisors seem to want to get back to simultaneous action, which of course North Korea is the one that stepped away from simultaneous action when they left the six-party framework. And then there's also the challenge of, North Korea really wants to talk denuclearization with the United States. And yet I think over the course of the past decade, denuclearization has become an issue that South Koreans, broadly speaking, feel that they have a stake in. And so it means that the Moon administration, I think, cannot escape finding ways to address that as part of their process for moving forward. But they're looking for flexibility in terms of how. And I think there's a lot of internal debate, which frankly I think will be influenced by the international environment and by consultations with the United States.
We don't know the sequencing or the conditionality, but I think Moon has signaled he wants to talk about a wide range of issues. He's raised a peace treaty, getting back to the six-party talks. I believe he's talked about the freeze. He wants to have dialogue. He said, as Scott pointed out in the inauguration, he wants to strengthen defenses and then engage, which is what Park Geun-hye said. And so he's also talked about South Korea should take the lead on issues on the Korean Peninsula, that it shouldn't be the U.S. and China talking about North Korea while South Korea is not there, which is the reason the U.S. pushed the six-party talks, because the U.S. had heard complaints from South Korea about the agreed framework where we were negotiating their security above their heads. So that's why we wanted the six-party talks, to have all of those impacted by North Korea's threats to be in the room, because everyone has different priorities or different issues. So again, how is that implemented? South Korea taking the lead, is that in close consultation with the U.S. and that we both agree on what South Korea will do, or if South Korea feels it's not getting satisfaction with the U.S., then will it go its own way or go further than we are comfortable with, just as sometimes South Korea felt we were going too far on the agreed framework or when we met unilaterally. So I think one issue I hope Moon brings up is human rights. Here you had, under the Nomi Hun administration, an administration staffed largely by human rights advocates, and yet they never criticized North Korea for its human rights conditions, the crimes against humanity. They felt that would undermine, their traction with North Korea, so they refused to sign UN agreements criticizing North Korea for its atrocities. So, and allegations are that the Nomi administration contacted North Korea asking them what they thought about South Korea signing the UN resolution criticizing them, and North Korea said, nah, you don't want to do that, so they didn't. So I do hope human rights is a strong issue in the inter-Korean dialogue.
I think Mr. Moon is quite different from the former President Roh Moo-hyun area. The time is changed, era is changed, and we have, and especially Mr. Moon know about the human rights issues in North Korea, and he also think about the North and South Korea have to getting some channel and to eliminate the nuclear weapon threat. So I think he tried to all kind of method, include human rights issues. So I think he tried to getting something about the human rights issue. Yeah.
Gentleman in the middle there.
Thank you. Leo Boston, a retired FEMA, currently teach disaster preparedness and sometimes in South Korea. Asking for a moment about a domestic issue within the country. The South Korean government has had real difficulties responding to emergencies within their country that hurt the civilian population. I'm thinking especially about the Seawall Ferry disaster of 3 years ago. Are there any indications that that kind of issue is going to be on the agenda for this new administration, or is it just too far down the list? Thank you.
Emergency, disaster emergency response.
Yeah.
Is that
in the wake of the Seawall? Is there going to be a higher government priority?
I did not see that addressed among the top 20 policy priorities that the Moon, huh? He said, for example, he's going to reestablish the Coast Guard. Okay, I didn't. Actually, under Roh Moo-hyun, there was a very effective emergency management function within the Blue House, and I think we'll have to see how the restructuring plays out.
Anybody else?
Okay, I'm Jing Gyu, the research fellow in the KIAP in the South Korea, and also the adjunct professor in the science and Johns Hopkins University in this area. And I have one question on broad question, both Scott and Bruce. And that I believe the current Mr. Trump is really enjoying the trade-off relation between national security issue and the economic issues. For example, Mr. Trump repressed China to control the North Korea in terms of a nuclear weapon program. And I think a similar strategy can be applicable to the South Korea. For example, Mr. Trump may suggest, Mr. Moon just take one among two options. For example, option one is just take some burden of the operation cost or expense. Or you can just give me your idea or plan to reduce current trade budget deficit. So there are sooner or later there will be some summit between Mr. Moon and Mr. Trump. And what is your expectation, the result of summit in terms of what I point out? Thank you.
Well, that's going to be a critical event in terms of framing the, I think, psychology of the relationship, and both, I think, leaders will have an interest in establishing some indication that they can work with each other, because they've got to live with each other for at least 4 years. And so I think both sides will work hard on that. With regards to the issue linkage that you raised, I mean, I'm not personally a great fan of that particular approach, and I'm not sure that it is really effective. But I think that those are the hardest kinds of negotiations between allies. Is negotiations that involve zero-sum issues related to the budget, and I'm sure that both sides will try their best. But in the end, I think they'll have to find, some kind of accommodation. Frankly, Moon has already indicated that he's willing to spend more on defense. He wants a lot of that to be directed on self-strengthening. Bruce has already raised that point. And so I think that, that can be part of a discussion. We'll have to see. I mean, with regard to the THAAD deployment, I really don't see any possibility or any reason why the South Korean government would pay for the deployment that's already gone on, because as far as I understand, that simply was not part of the deal. Going forward, if South Korea wants to buy some more batteries, although it doesn't sound like Moon is really interested in that product, I'm sure that we would sell it. Let's see.
I think on linking economics and national security, I think on the one hand, you look at the totality of a relationship between two countries, but you don't want to hold sort of everything hostage over one issue. On the other hand, I don't think you want to make it a quid pro quo. I mean, look what with the U.S.-China summit, where there's a sense of, I'm going to reduce trade pressure on China in return for their wonderful help that they've promised on North Korea. Well, I don't think you should make that quid pro quo. You kind of address each issue. If there's economic issues that you think need to be addressed, well, you don't kind of sacrifice them over, particularly in my view, yet again another promise of China doing what it's promised before. I don't think you make that kind of deal. So, that said, you don't stovepipe issues. They do kind of influence each other. So I realize it's not a very good answer, but I don't think you want to make we'll sacrifice this economic issue in return for you paying for something, or vice versa.
Want to add anything? Anybody else? Gentleman back there.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. A couple of political science type of questions. Min's winning percentage is 41%. Is that less than he got 5 years ago? Did he show great growth in his support rate over the course of the campaign? It seems like Mr. Hong was third or fourth at one point and gradually moved up. Was that done at the expense of drawing from An's support? And looking at the National Assembly, which is now, I think, almost a stagnant assembly in terms of getting anything done, it seems the third party there, the People's Party, which is An's party, has about 35, 40 seats. Are they the kingpin in how the National Assembly, which is going to be around for another 3 years, unlike previous National Assemblies and presidents, where I think there was a change in the National Assembly shortly after the presidential vote. So it seems like we're stuck with a lot less than we perhaps are expecting in terms of a new administration. Maybe a rather weak president and a divided government, or a stagnant National Assembly, and not much chance of really breaking that deadlock unless An was to somehow disappear and either join the government or join the Conservatives, or which I guess he was more on the with the Democratic Party in the past. But what's the likelihood of that kind of development coming forward in order to break through what seems to be a formula for stagnation and no progress at all there?
I think on pure numbers, and I think Moon this time had a lower number than he had 5 years ago, but it was a totally different race. That race was two people, really, two candidates, and now you had five, of different strengths. But I don't think you can really compare the numbers as to, if he had a lower number, then it shows he has less widespread support because it was just a very different race. But obviously, Korea's divided. So whether you have the South-South divide or the ideological divide, generational divide, there's a lot of schisms in society that he will now try to unite in order to rule. But as Scott pointed out, the rule change in the National Assembly, which I think was largely put into place to prevent fisticuffs on the National Assembly floor, and the use of fire axes and fire extinguishers and everything in a free and frank exchange of ideas. And one of my favorite pictures from years ago was a photo of two National Assembly members, hauling off against each other, and the caption was National Assembly Members Debate Peace Initiative. It was just sort of a great thing. So, I think rather than sort of saying, hey, folks, could you not haul off against each other, they put in place this measures, which, as Scott pointed out, really created stagnancy in the National Assembly. So I think with the rule change and this division, it does seem a recipe for continued stagnation. Park Geun-hye was complaining that sort of things couldn't get done even when she had the ruling party. So we will hope that they can move forward in the right direction, and we can debate the direction. But I think just like in any country, you're going to have a lot of stagnancy and divisions and difficulty in getting things done.
Every nation have a division all over the part, woman and the man, and South and North. Korea is also have some division issue, and when I was congressman just 4 years, we never seen the fighting in National Assembly again, and that is systematically we cannot to the fighting and that means that the Korea is changing now and is going to better politic system, and as he said 5 years ago, Mr. Moon getting maybe about 48% now, but he was lost. But now this time he got 41%, but he won. It is changing, and there are so many changing because especially Mr. Moon really try to focus reform of all the custom in the politics and economic system. So I expect the changing the new Korea, and we can expect, I think.
Yeah, there's an immediate test, really, of Moon's strength that is directly related to this question, and that is he named his prime minister, the governor of Jeolla province, can't remember if it's south or north, South Jeolla province, who will now be put up for National Assembly hearings, and there will be a vote. But also, the main support from the People's Party, the smaller progressive party, is really from Jeolla province. And so I think that Moon is already essentially making a kind of bid for support that is also designed to to build a some kind of working consensus that will allow him to move forward. If nothing else, he will have, and in fact he exhibited, stronger support from Chala province during the election campaign. He's now provided a kind of reward to the province and a potential lever to be able to at least ensure that he has a working coalition and the possibility of gaining majority support. It doesn't yet mean, I think, that he can quite reach that 60% threshold. They're very close, and I'm not sure the exact numbers, but I think they would need to win a few by-elections in order to be able to really be able to overcome that level.
I'll give the last. Go ahead. Oh, okay. There's a gentleman behind you. Okay.
Sorry. Sorry. Thanks. Nicholas Hamasevich, PhD student at Catholic University. Is there anything that President Moon can learn from other world leaders of countries where the Trump administration or President Trump during the campaign had harsh words for, and how those leaders have tried to deal with President Trump now that he's in office? I'm thinking maybe in particular some of the Asian leaders like Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Abe, or Prime Minister Turnbull from Australia.
Play golf.
But I don't think Moon plays golf.
Well, you better
He
learn.
can't. But he can. He really enjoy hiking.
Yeah.
Yes, with the hiking with the Trump. Yeah, I think there are so many hiking places in Mar-a-Lago in the Christ.
No, but actually,
Just squeeze one more question.
but I think to be a little more serious, I think, I mean, it'd be simplistic to say if Moon compliments Trump and then that'll establish a good relationship. But I think, when the guidance to Moon would be sort of, sir, look, there are a lot of questions, even concerns, perceptions, perhaps misperceptions about you and your policies and your platform. People have imprinted No Myuhan onto you because you are the chief of staff, rightly or wrongly, but you're carrying No's baggage. So as you're either calling or meeting with Trump, highlight the convergence. We like hearing that, thank you for the Korean War and the rebuilding of the country. So, that's a issue that Park Geun-hye and others have always emphasized. So I think highlighting the common values, the embrace of democracy and rule of law and respect for human rights, etc., the alliance, the facing common enemies, I think you lead with that, and that creates a good foundation. And then if you have a good foundation, a good personal relationship, and a good bilateral relationship, then if you have disagreements, well, you sort of deal with that. So things like the civilian nuclear deal, the 1-2-3 agreement between the U.S. and South Korea, I had thought that would cause a lot more problems. But it was because the relationship was so positive at the time, and I think a lot of people did a lot of behind-the-scenes briefing in newspapers and stuff of explaining the details, but it was sort of okay, we had some differences, neither side won everything, but okay. Whereas if the relationship had been much more tense at the time, that could have led to even, anti-American demonstrations, or, to kind of take it a bit far. But, I think you need to establish that personal relationship based on shared values and shared objectives first.
So just a brief two-part question, and so please feel free to give short answers, because I know we're close on time. But to National Assemblyman Song, under Lee Myung-bak, we had the Global Korea policy, where Korea tried to work with countries sort of beyond Northeast Asia and do things around the world. That somewhat fell off under Park Geun-hye. Do you see President Moon trying to be more involved on a global basis, sort of more like Lee Myung-bak, or do you see him focusing more on the region? And then, Scott, sort of a related question would be, much of this cooperation was done with the United States on various projects, and you've done a lot of work on this. Maybe even a shorter question. Do you see the Trump administration interested in continuing that cooperation or uninterested?
I think Mr. Moon have same policy about the economic or trade policies with Lee Myung-bak or Park Geun-hye, or not the same. Maybe I think developing policy and more to the globals, toward to globals, I think. Yes. And that you can find his policy in this election. Yes, that more globalization is his policy. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that the precursors of the global Korea policy were evident during the Roh Moo-hyun administration, and therefore I think this aspiration to play a broader role, it really comes clear in the Moon platforms in his emphasis on responsibility. I think we'll see that, but I also believe that it's going to be more focused on, we'll have to see what the scope is in terms of how Moon defines his policy. I have a feeling it might remain a little bit more regional in the initial phase. And will the Trump administration engage in that way? I mean, those are kind of the parts of our broader policy that seem to be under stress or under duress in terms of budget support, et cetera. So we'll have to see.
No, I think just maybe on the global Korea, I wonder if some of that was driven by if, the U.S. under Bush was looking to do a number of things overseas, and whether it was we were asking Korea to do things or whether they were offering to do that. Whereas if Trump is perhaps going to be more insular, not do a number of the things that, Bush wanted to do overseas, if he's going to be more, not isolationist, but transactional or whatever, then there's not that pull from the U.S. for South Korea to be playing a larger role. But I think one thing that I often hear from Korean colleagues is, they'll point to Korea hosting some big event and sort of say, is this our coming out party? What about the G20 or the nuclear summit or whatever? It's sort of like, folks, you've arrived. You're a small country, but punching extremely above your weight. You are a player on the world stage, so you have impact, disproportionately to your size of population and geography. So I think whether Moon talks about being a global, country or not, Korea does have an impact on the world stage. So I think that's a positive thing for whoever the South Korean president is perhaps they don't realize the impact that South Korea does and can have.
Okay. Thank you very much. I hope you found it a stimulating discussion. I want to thank our distinguished panel, and please give them a big round of applause.